Hi, today I want to critique how people drastically over-exaggerate the Nintendo 64. What do you mean my favorite childhood game system wasn't the best? You just read off its best games in such a dismissive tone, without even mentioning their shining brilliance? This is treasonous, a hate piece even. Everyone knows that the system I had as a kid had the objectively better hardware and the objectively better games. I can't even name more than 2 good games in that pile of shovelware that the other system had in its library. How dare you, insulting the greatest games ever created on the greatest console of all time? Blasphemy! You're ruining my childhood. How dare you? This is what happens when you comment before you watch a video. So please, watch until the end and then comment. Anyways, I want to go over how the Nintendo 64 is harmed by people who over-exaggerate not only the quality of the system, but the quality of the games on it. I would also like to explain what something aging well means first, though. I mean, a game doesn't age or rot physically, well, most of the time. Instead, when we say a game has aged well or poorly, it depends on how it's stacked up against modern games within the same genre. Games that were quite revolutionary or ambitious back in the day often end up looking and aging worse than the games that played it safe and only use established mechanics. Compare how Draken aged in comparison to Super Mario World. I mean, one of them is Super Mario World, the other one is a 3D, 2D-ish SNES RPG. Even today, people push the idea that a Nintendo 64 is the best system of all time, even sometimes commenting under unrelated posts about other systems and saying, when you said you loved the PlayStation, you spelled the Nintendo 64 wrong. While this does happen with other systems, it is nowhere near as prevalent as with the Nintendo 64. The angry guy at the beginning was just a compilation of everything I've read in my own comments, so that's where my source is. Everything from saying that objectively the Nintendo was better, how while the PlayStation 1 had a big library, the Nintendo 64 had the best games ever made on it, to just calling me a contrarian, saying Nintendo invented 3D gaming or the analog stick, neither of which is true, saying me abbreviating game names for the sake of brevity was derogatory, that this is a Nintendo 64 hate piece, that the Nintendo 64 had a higher fun factor, etc. So I would like to go over some stuff with you. Has Mario 64 aged well? Not really. You see, the main gripe that I've been trying very hard to describe was that Mario's movement works best in big open levels because he kind of handled like a steel ball bearing. And then half the levels, especially in the later half of the game, are just tight platforming gauntlets. Later Nintendo 64 platformers like Banjo have far better controls and movement than Mario 64. Later Zelda games, I'm talking GameCube, etc., aged and felt far better to play and control than Ocarina of Time. As ambitious as a lot of these Nintendo 64 games were, and PlayStation games as well, they really show their age in a lot of places. One thing that actually hurts a lot of very beloved Nintendo games is the expectation that people build up for them. I've seen people call Mario 64 the best 3D platformer of all time, or Ocarina of Time still the best 3D Zelda game. While these are some of the best games released in 1998 and 1996, people will go into these old, janky games with the expectation that, wow, this must be even better than Odyssey, or insert whichever modern Zelda game isn't currently being nitpicked to death. And because of that, they'll be put off by how decisively mid to late 90s these games are in every department. They're ambitious, primitive, rougher than 1-grit sandpaper in quite a few areas. And that's what makes them special. Their ambition, but to someone with grand expectations, they'll probably get disillusioned quickly and give up. Though, you have noticed how often people talk about Nintendo 64 games and talk them up, specifically, even though 5th generation 3D games are often the jankiest and least polished games in their respective series. So, here's why the Nintendo 64 Library feels far more memorable to a lot of people. It's really simple. There were just far less games, so a smaller amount of them became more memorable. You see, in the West, the Nintendo 64 had a little under 300 games, versus the PlayStation 1's 4,000. And as most Nintendo 64 owners were younger, they would probably own a few notable titles as the selection of games was small and you didn't have infinite money, so you would only get the stuff that was really recognizable: Mario, Zelda, Banjo, etc. Then you would probably have a strange game or two that your parents or aunt or whoever got you for your birthday, Christmas, whatever, because they thought you'd like it. Like Clay Fighter, Wetrix, something bizarre. Meanwhile, on the PlayStation, there were just so many games that you, the often teenager to young adult, could just buy the genre that you were into. Like racing games? Good, there's 20 billion of them. Like RPGs? Even better, there's 40 quadrillion of them. Like platformers? Sorry mate, there's only 10 billion of them. People would have far less in common when they looked back at the system 20 years down the line, as they could exclusively play the games they were the most interested in, and not just what was out at the time. But even so, that makes a better system overall, even if it's a little less memorable in that specific way. Of course, all reviews are subjective, but some are more subjective than others. I tried to minimize my own subjectivity, though it did shine through in my belief that the PlayStation D-pad was better than the alternatives, as I've always personally found it superior. Otherwise, I've seen quite a few comments that I wasn't being objective, yet they could never explain where I was being subjective, minus the D-pad thing. One big thing which I read about is the fun factor present on the Nintendo 64. What is fun factor? I don't know, and neither do you, and neither did the person who made that comment. But it turns out that 4-player gaming was huge on the Nintendo 64. Of course, I didn't really mention that because I thought it was kind of moot. Because if I had to mention that, I'd have to mention RPGs and other genres, and it would just be a long mess. But then I looked into it for fun, and it turns out that the PlayStation 1 had something like twice the 4-player game library of the Nintendo 64, with a catch. A $30, well, $29.99 catch. The PlayStation multi-tap. If you claim this as cheating, you'll be thrown into the piranha pool. Of course, going over the actual 4-player library just out of curiosity, I noticed something very interesting. First of all, there were 8-player games on the PlayStation. Second of all, both on the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation, the 4-party library consisted primarily of sports games, then some racing games, and maybe a couple action games, a party of fighting games. Meanwhile, on the PlayStation, because it came with 2 controller ports as standard, there were a lot of 2D multiplayer games that could be far more deep and large because you only needed to render 2 players instead of 4. Games like Gran Turismo 2, for instance, you can just load up an arcade game with 2 players, or Future Cop LAPD. It's not quite 4 players, but it's much more common to have 1 person over than 3. And that is kind of the point I was trying to get across. The Nintendo 64 had some high-quality titles, of course, and they were definitely high quality, but the PlayStation 1 had quantity and quality. The Nintendo 64 had some very big games: Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, GoldenEye, Super Smash Bros., sure. But the PlayStation had Crash, Final Fantasy, Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, Tekken, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Driver. Almost all of these games had more than 1 title released on the platform, and all of them were highly reviewed. The only 4 big games with sequels on the Nintendo 64 were Mario Party, Zelda, Turok, and Banjo. And let's deal with the other Nintendo 64 games. Were Banjo, Turok, Mario Party Conker, and the other big Nintendo 64 games good? Of course they were. Were they as important as the games I listed previously? Of course not. Similarly, Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, Spyro, Siphon Filter, Legend of Dragoon, and many other games were all very big on PlayStation, but they just weren't as important as the ones I mentioned above. And I've seen people complain I didn't mention Ridge Racer 64, and yeah, for a reason. It's just not as influential or important. What you have to understand is, even if you believe that some game is the best of all time, that doesn't make it true. The game may be good, the game may be of high quality. You may love the game, a lot of people may love the game. That doesn't mean the game is particularly big or important. By insisting that Nintendo 64 is all there was, you're basically just denying yourself the fun experience of more games, purely because of a console war that ended over 20 years ago. And it works in reverse as well. If you hate on the Nintendo 64 all day, you're still missing out on some fun experiences. And if you can endure the jank of one platform, you can just as easily endure the jank of the other platform. One big thing which I've read from quite a few people, and what I've learned in discussions, is how, for a lot of older people, the PlayStation is what kept them in gaming as they were growing up, because the more mature games. And logically you would think, if so many of the Nintendo 64 games were so influential, why does it seem like so many future games almost exclusively pull from things featured in a lot of PlayStation titles, and only maybe pull like an idea or two from a couple Nintendo 64 titles? There's also a second, much more interesting aspect to this. It usually happens with systems like the Dreamcast and Saturn, but it's seen far more often with the Wii U, GameCube, and especially the Nintendo 64. That being people who never owned or cared about these systems, often people younger than the systems, who completely swear by them now. The Nintendo 64 sold the best out of all the common underdog systems, and many younger people would often flock to defend the system because their YouTuber loved to talk about them. And that's because that YouTuber was pretty young when the system was new. I mean, you've seen it happen with the Wii U and GameCube, though to a far lesser extent, as a lot of YouTubers who spend their time talking about the systems, like Scott, are often far more realistic and critical of the systems than the many now older videos on the Nintendo 64, as a decade plus ago, the standards of YouTuber reviewer integrity were far lower. We were just getting out of the angry reviewer era, and people overcompensated for the annoying, overreacting hatred of those guys by glorifying everything they talked about. And while that is better than the alternative by a lot, it still caused a lot of people to have very rose-tinted and skewed views of the past, and then because of that, some of those people decided to attack the games that weren't talked about because, well, if they were talked about, they would be good, and they weren't talked about, so they weren't. And as stated previously, that hurts you the most. If you think an entire system has nothing on it worth playing, you're just denying yourself the experience of finding something new to enjoy. And with every comment you post saying, "Oh, you love this system? Well, bucko, it sucked. This one is objectively better." You're not changing any minds, you're not gonna do anything, nobody's gonna say, "Yeah, I'm gonna throw it in the bin and buy this other system." You're just validating your own nostalgia and ego. And yeah, my video may have ruffled a lot of feathers, even if it was specifically designed to minimize that. It was an idea I had. I wanted to see if I could say the least amount of controversial stuff, except for the D-pad preference, and see if people would still hallucinate reasons to disagree, even if I tried my best to only keep it to things that I could fully back up with numbers. And guess what? It validated what I already suspected. The vast majority of the retro gaming community is full of wonderful people who all have their own personal thoughts and experiences that influence their opinions on retro games. The vast majority of them are reasonable and intelligent, and it was quite nice reading some of the personal experiences people had in the comments. However, there's a very small amount of extremely vocal people, as there are in basically every single community on the internet, that just, in this case, can't let go and have to tell everyone how much better their box was. So maybe instead of trying to argue tooth and nail about how your box is better, maybe sometimes accept the fact that not everything that you like is the best. It's fine. And realistically speaking, it doesn't matter. If you find value in something, the quality, the power, the reception of that thing doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you find it fun, and all you're doing by dismissing an entire platform is ruining all of those experiences for yourself and telling yourself, no, I don't care about them. When in reality, you should. Go try one of them. Try Mega Man Legends 2.